On a dry and dusty planet called Zaratha, the air is hot and heavy, and the ground is cracked and empty of life. The sky is orange, and the sun never hides behind clouds. The people of Zaratha walk slowly and talk softly because every word and every movement costs them water, and water is the most precious thing in the world here. In a small, broken village on the edge of the city, a young alien girl named Surya sits alone near an empty well. Her skin is dry, and her lips are cracked, and her eyes are wide with fear and hunger. Her clothes are torn, and her fingers shake as she looks around the empty village. Everyone is hiding inside, afraid of the heat and afraid of the law. But Surya cannot wait anymore. She is weak and thirsty, and she knows she will not live to see another night if she does not drink soon. She hears a sound in the distance, the hum of a water facility. It is forbidden to go near it, but Surya stands up slowly and begins to walk. Her small feet leave marks in the sand, and her heart beats faster with every step. The tall towers of the facility rise like giants made of metal, and the silver tanks shine like treasure. She sneaks past the fence and hides behind a wall. Her eyes lock onto a small, leaking pipe. The drops of water glisten in the light, and her mouth waters with hope. She runs to the pipe and places her hands beneath it, catching every drop like it is a gift from the stars. She brings the water to her mouth and drinks quickly. Her body feels alive again, and she wants to cry, but she cannot, because crying wastes water. Suddenly, a loud alarm rings through the air. Red lights flash, and metal guards roll out from behind doors. They are shaped like spiders with long arms and red eyes, and they shout in a voice that makes the ground shake. Surya tries to run, but the guards catch her in seconds. Their cold arms wrap around her and lift her off the ground. She screams, but no one comes to help. A loudspeaker above her crackles, and a voice speaks to the whole city. This girl has stolen from the sacred supply, it says, and the punishment is clear. Her right arm will be taken as the law demands. In the city square, people gather to watch the punishment. Their faces are tired and blank, and they say nothing as the girl is dragged onto the stage. Chains clink around her wrists, and her eyes are wide with fear. Machine stands ready beside her. Sharp tools gleam in the sunlight. The crowd watches in silence. But one person in the back does not look away in fear or in boredom. He looks with fire in his eyes. His name is Raylan, and he is not from Zaratha. He is a human from a faraway planet sent here as part of a peace group. He has seen many things on many planets, but this moment feels different. This feels wrong. He watches the girl struggle, and something inside him burns. He cannot look away. He pushes through the crowd, his boots sinking into the dust, his voice rising above the silence. "Stop," he shouts. "Do not do this. She is just a child." The guards turn and aim their weapons at him, but he does not stop walking. The crowd parts, and people whisper the human is interfering. They say the girl looks at Raylan with confused eyes. She has never seen a human up close before. She wonders why this stranger would speak for her when her own people stay quiet. The leader of the guard steps forward, his armor shining like silver bones. He tells Raylan that the law is clear and no one can stop it. Raylan says he will pay for the water with his own rations, but the guard laughs and says no one can buy mercy with drops. Then Raylan says something that makes everyone go still. He says, "Take my arm instead. Let her go and take mine." The crowd gasps. Even the guards freeze for a second. The leader steps closer and looks at Raylan with cold eyes. He asks if the human is joking, but Raylan does not move. He stands tall and calm, his arm outstretched. The crowd begins to whisper again. Some think he is brave, others think he is mad. The girl stares at him, her mouth open, her eyes filling with something new, something called hope. The leader of the guard says he will take the offer to the council, but warns Raylan that this act may cost him more than his arm. He turns and leads the girl and the human away. The square is silent again, but the silence is heavy like a storm about to break. People begin to talk quietly about what they saw, about the girl, about the human, and about the old laws that no longer feel right. Somewhere deep in the city, a door is opening, a story is beginning, and nothing on Zaratha will ever be the same again. The wind was dry and sharp as Raylan walked through the silent corridors of the great city hall of Zaratha. The walls were tall and smooth, made of red stone, pulled from the heart of the planet. The guards walked behind him with cold faces and heavy steps. The alien girl, Surya, walked beside him, her head low and her arms tied with golden wire. The people outside watched the doors close behind them, not speaking, just breathing slow and heavy like the planet itself. Raylan looked at Saria and saw how small. She was, her bones thin like twigs, her eyes tired, but still alive. He wanted to speak to her, but the silence in the hall was loud and thick. The guards led them to a huge chamber at the center of the city, a dome that rose like a mountain covered in mirrors and glass that reflected the sky. In the heat, the doors opened without a sound, and inside sat the council of Zaratha, 13 figures wrapped in black robes with faces hidden by masks of bone and light. The head of the council spoke with a voice like iron dragged across stone. He asked Raylan why he had interfered with the punishment, and Raylan said he could not stand by and watch a child suffer for drops of water. He said justice without mercy was not justice, but cruelty. The council did not move. Their glowing eyes stared at him from behind the masks. And then the leader asked if Raylan still wished to give his arm in place of the girl. Raylan looked at Saria and nodded. He said he would give more. If needed, the chamber fell into silence again, and the council whispered to each other in voices like wind and fire. After a long moment, the leader stood and said the offer was accepted. The punishment would be carried out at dusk, and the girl would walk free. The guards untied Saria, and she looked at Raylan with wide eyes that could not believe what they heard. The council ordered Raylan to stay in the chamber until dusk, and the guards took Saria away to be cleaned and fed. For the first time in days, her hands shook as she held a cup of water, but she drank it all and did not cry, because crying still wasted water. She asked the guard why the human had helped her, and the guard only said humans are strange and dangerous and never follow rules. Meanwhile, Raylan sat alone in the chamber, thinking about his home, about the green hills of Earth and the cool rivers he used to swim in as a boy. He thought about the first time he saw a dry world and how it hurt him to see children grow up without rain. He closed his eyes and felt the dry wind of Zaratha on his face, and he wondered if his choice would change anything at all. As the sun began to fall, the chamber doors opened, and the guards returned. They told Raylan it was time, and he stood without fear. His heart was calm like a still lake outside. In the square, the people gathered again. But now they were not silent. They whispered louder than before, asking if it was true, if the human would really lose his arm for a child, not his own. They waited as the platform was raised and Raylan was brought before them. Saria stood in the front, her hands clenched and her eyes locked on the man who had saved her. She did not speak. She only watched as the machine was brought out again. The same machine that had been ready to hurt her now stood before Raylan. The metal arms clicked and whirred, and the tools gleamed in the last light of day. The crowd watched and waited, their hearts full of questions they had never asked before. The guard leader stepped forward and asked Raylan one last time if he wanted to stop, but Raylan said no and held out his arm. The machine moved close, and everyone held their breath. But before the blade could touch his skin, a loud cry broke the silence. It was Saria. She ran forward and stood between Raylan and the machine, shouting that he should not suffer for her, that the laws were broken, that water should not cost a life or a limb. The guards moved to stop her, but the crowd stepped forward too, not to hurt her, but to protect her. Voices rose from all sides, saying the punishment was too cruel, saying the law needed to change. The council watched from above, their eyes glowing brighter with every voice that joined the protest. The guard leader looked up, waiting for a signal, and after a long pause, the council leader raised one hand and spoke. He said the punishment was paused, that no arm would be taken today, and that the law would be reviewed for the first time in 100 years. The crowd cheered, not loud, but deep like thunder rolling under the surface of the world. Raylan lowered his arm and looked at Saria, who smiled for the first time since he met her. The people of Zaratha walked away that night with more than dust in their shoes. They walked away with questions in their hearts and a small light that maybe things could change. And high above them all in the silent sky, the stars watched as a new story began on the desert planet where mercy had found a place to grow. The sun rose slowly over Zaratha, casting long golden shadows across the city of red stone. The streets were quiet, but the silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, filled with whispers and thoughts that people dared not say out loud. The air was dry as always, but something about it felt different, like it was waiting to carry a storm that had yet to begin. In the heart of the city, Raylan sat on a stone bench watching the early traders set up their stalls and lay out their goods: water, beads, spices, metal tools, and small machines that still worked after hundreds of years. Saria sat beside him, holding a small piece of bread in her hands. Her eyes watched everything like they were seeing the world for the first time. She had never known a morning like this, one a morning without fear, without chains, without pain. Raylan handed her a warm drink made from ground roots, and she took it slowly, unsure if it was real, She looked at the human, her voice quiet, as she asked if he truly believed things would change. Raylan looked toward the rising sun and said change never comes fast, but it always begins somewhere, and maybe this moment, this morning, was the place it had chosen to begin. He told her stories of Earth, of rivers wide as the sky, of rain that fell like music on rooftops and grasslands that danced with the wind. Her eyes widened with every word, and she asked if one day she could see Earth with her own eyes. Raylan smiled and said, one day, maybe sooner than she thought, but first there was work to do, not just for him, but for all of Zaratha. The people had begun to speak to one another, to wonder aloud if laws could change, if mercy had a place in their world, and that was dangerous to some and powerful to others, for in the halls of the council there were those who saw Raylan not as a savior, but as a threat, a spark that might burn the old ways to ash. Counselor Vareth watched from the shadows of the chamber, his mask heavier than the others, his voice sharp and bitter. He had lived through revolts before, had seen how one act of kindness could unravel the laws that had kept order for centuries. He whispered to the others that Raylan must be watched, that he must not be allowed to spread his ideas unchecked, that change must be controlled or it would destroy them all. Meanwhile, in the outer sectors of the city, more children came forward with stories of stolen water, of hidden wells of nights, spent digging through sand for drops of life. The people listened and began to ask why such things were hidden, why a planet with machines that flew through stars could not share something as simple as water. And as the question spread, so did hope, but so too did fear. Raylan and Saria visited the outer zones, meeting families who had nothing but dust and silence. They brought words, food, and ideas. They spoke of justice that did not cut off arms, of rules that could bend like branches, not snap like dry bones. Saria began to speak as well, her voice once afraid, now clear and steady. She told them she had once been punished for stealing a cup of water, but now she walked free because someone cared enough to stop and speak. The children listened with wide eyes, the elders with narrow ones, and some with both hope and suspicion. One man, named Corin, stepped forward, his skin cracked from years in the sun, his eyes sharp as flint. He said he had lost a son to the old laws, and he would not believe in change unless he saw it with his own eyes. Raylan took his hand and said, then come with us and see what truth we build together. But the walls of the city held more than just dust and stone. Hidden in the deepest rooms of the council hall, machines woke from long sleep. Ancient watchers that once monitored peace in the Great War ages ago, now repurposed to listen to whispers and track the paths of those who moved against the old order. Counselor Vareth stood before one such machine and gave it a name, Raylan. He told it to follow, to record, to listen to every word the human said, and to find weakness, for even one spark could light a fire, and Vareth intended to crush it before it burned too bright outside in the streets. Raylan felt the eyes, though he could not see them. He told Saria to be careful, to watch the faces around them for kindness, but also for masks that smiled without truth. Saria nodded and promised she would be strong. She asked if fear ever went away, and Raylan said no, but it could be outshined by courage. And she smiled again, not because she believed it fully, but because she wanted to believe, because hope was a new feeling, and she liked how it made her chest feel warm and light, like maybe she could fly. And so the sun climbed higher over Zaratha, lighting every roof, every alley, every silent doorway. And behind those doors, people whispered the name of the human, and the girl who spoke of rain and rivers and mercy. And far beneath it all, deep in the chambers of the city, something ancient turned its gaze toward them and began to wake. The sky above Zaratha grew pale as gray clouds formed like bruises across the endless desert. The wind whispered along the broken towers and narrow streets, and the city seemed to breathe slower, as if something unseen pressed against its heart. Raylan stood before a gathering of workers and elders and traders whose faces were dry and worn by the sun, yet something glimmered behind their tired eyes, something not seen in generations. They had come not for trade or orders, but to listen to a human who dared to question the way things were. Beside Raylan stood Saria, wrapped in a light scarf to shield her from the grit. In the air, her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for anything strange or out of place. Ever since Raylan had spoken about watching for hidden eyes, she had learned to notice things. She had learned that safety was not a gift, but something you fought for with every word, with every step. Raylan began to speak, his voice steady and full of quiet power. He did not shout, and he did not preach. He spoke about life, about how water should not be guarded like gold, about how mercy was stronger than fear, and how rules could be rewritten if the people chose it together. He reminded them that every empire fell not by war, but by silence. When people forgot how to care, how to speak, how to dream, he told them they were not broken, they were simply waiting for the moment to stand. A boy in the crowd raised his hand and asked why a human should lead them, why someone from another world cared about their laws, their children, their future. Raylan smiled and said, because kindness was not born from planets or blood, it was born from choice, and he had made his choice the day he saw a young girl punished for trying to live. Whispers spread across the crowd like ripples in still water, and for a moment the city held its breath. Then an old woman stepped forward, her back bent, her hands shaking. She held out a jug of water and poured a small cup, handing it to Raylan. She said, let this be the first act of a new law, where water begins with sharing. And Raylan took the cup and gave it to Saria, whose hands trembled as she accepted the gift. But far above them, hidden behind dark glass in the Tower of Council, the Watchers recorded every moment, every word, every movement. Machines blinked awake and tracked faces, measured sound, and noted patterns. Counselor Vareth stared at the feed, his fingers tapping on cold metal. He saw not unity, but rebellion. He saw not hope, but danger. And he turned to the others with a voice filled with warning. He said the human had gone too far, that kindness had become a weapon, that mercy had turned into poison. He demanded action before the old walls crumbled and the council split. Some nodded in fear, others hesitated, unsure if they stood before the fall or the rise of something greater. Vareth did not wait. He issued orders, quiet and sharp like knives in the dark. That night, Raylan and Saria returned to the shelter they had made from the remains of an old station. The roof was patched, the lights weak, but it was theirs. The people had helped build it brick by brick with hands that once only obeyed and now chose to create. Saria smiled as she looked at the simple walls and said, this place feels alive. Raylan agreed and told her that walls held memories, and these walls would remember the first whispers of change. Outside, the stars began to shine, but one star moved differently. It flickered with purpose and light and speed. It was not a star at all, but a drone mast in sky. It hovered just outside the shelter, its lens unblinking, its core humming with power. It listened and waited, its orders clear, its target known. Inside, Raylan spoke about the next day, about gathering more voices, about meeting the desert tribes who had long been exiled and forgotten. He believed they too deserved water. He believed all life deserved to be seen. Saria asked what would happen if the council struck back, and Raylan said, then they would stand together, even if the wind blew hard, even if the sky turned black. Suddenly a sound echoed outside, sharp and electric and wrong. Saria grabbed Raylan's arm and pulled him down just before the wall behind them exploded in sparks and smoke. The shelter shook, dust rained from the ceiling, and outside red lights flashed and the dark shapes moved fast. And without sound the council had made their move, and it came not with debate but destruction. Raylan covered Saria with his body, shielding her from falling debris. He shouted for her to stay low, to keep breathing, to remember the fire in her chest, the fire that came from hope, not fear. Together, they crawled to the side hatch and slipped into the shadows of the back alley, where broken machines once slept. The streets were not silent now. Alarms howled, and footsteps chased ghosts. The people looked from windows and doors, unsure whether to run or rise. Raylan knew this was no longer about speeches. This was about survival, and Saria knew, too, that the world had changed in one breath. As they moved through the shadows, the drone followed silent and cold. It watched the human and the girl who once stole water and now stole hearts, and the storm that had waited behind the eyes of Zaratha had finally begun to roar. The winds over Zaratha howled like voices crying from the bones of the past. The desert air was sharp and dry, as if the land itself had been scorched by the fear rising in the hearts of its people. Broken lights flickered over the narrow streets, casting shadows that danced like ghosts, and among them ran two figures, a human and an alien girl bound by something stronger than blood. Raylan moved with steady steps, though the pain in his side screamed with every breath. He knew they could not stop, not now, not after the attack on the shelter, not after the fire that tore through their safe place, where hope had finally begun to grow. Saria stayed, close her eyes, scanning the rooftops and dark corners, remembering every twist and path she had ever walked as a child, hiding from the law, hiding from the hunger. Behind them, the sky blinked with the red eyes of machines, hunting them like prey. Drones moved in patterns cold and perfect, each pulse of their wings a reminder that the Council had no more patience, no more mercy. The order was clear: eliminate the threat, destroy the voice that dared to speak the truth. But Raylan had seen the truth in the eyes of the crowd before the blast. He had seen people waking from years of silence, like stone turning back into flesh, and he knew the Council feared not him, but what he had stirred inside the hearts of the forgotten. They reached the old aquifer tunnels beneath the city. Broken pipes lined the walls, and water dripped from above, not clean, not pure, but enough to survive for now. Saria pointed to a hatch hidden behind rusted beams. She remembered playing there as a child, pretending to be free, and now that same path might save them. She led Raylan down in the dark, where the air was thick and warm and silent. As they moved through the tunnel, the silence broke with the soft sound of footsteps. There's not alone. Saria pulled Raylan behind a collapsed beam and waited. The footsteps grew louder, closer. A light shone across the passage and stopped just inches away. Then a voice spoke, low and careful, asking if they were the ones from the shelter. Raylan answered without fear, and the light lowered, revealing a young man with desert robes and metal tools strapped to his chest. He said his name was Kale, and that he had seen the blast and the smoke, and the people who tried to help were taken by the enforcers. He had escaped through an old maintenance route, and now he searched for Raylan because his words had lit something inside him, something he had not felt since he was a child. Raylan nodded and welcomed Kale without question, for he believed that trust had to be given if change was to grow together. They moved deeper into the tunnels, finding a small chamber where old maps and forgotten tech lay buried in dust. Saria cleared a space, and Kale lit a soft lamp that glowed like starlight. They rested there for a moment, Raylan wrapping his wound with cloth torn from his sleeve, Saria staring at a piece of broken glass, where her face looked older than before, and Kale watching them with the eyes of someone who had found cause. Raylan spoke again, not to inspire, but to plan. He said they could no longer wait for the Council to come to them. They had to move first. They had to reach the outer tribes, the ones banished to the sands centuries ago, the ones who knew the land and the sky better than any sensor or drone. Kale said he knew someone who could guide them across the dunes, a smuggler named Vera, who once ran power cells to the mining slaves now living in the cracks of the world. She owed Kale a favor, and she hated the Council more than hunger. They would need to leave before sunrise, before the next wave of machines flooded the city. As they prepared to move, a sound echoed down the tunnel, a metal clang, followed by a hiss like steam. It was a drone, searching, blind and slow, but deadly. Kale pointed to a vent above the chamber, narrow, but just wide enough for one at a time. They climbed through, Raylan first, then Saria, then Kale, closing the grate, just as the drone entered the room below, scanning empty walls and breathing dust. Outside the tunnel, they emerged into the edge of the city, where towers gave way to stone and sand. Vera was waiting, wrapped in black with eyes like fire. She looked at Raylan, then at Saria, and said she did not carry dead weight, and Raylan replied that neither did they. She smirked and led them to her crawler, a machine half buried in sand and rust, but alive with energy. As the crawler rolled across the dunes, Raylan looked back at Zaratha, where smoke still rose into the night sky. He knew there would be no going back, no peace without price, but he also knew that something had changed, something real and alive and fierce. Beside him, Suya sat with her hand gripping the edge of the seat, her eyes on the horizon, where stars met sand, where silence would be broken by voices once forgotten, and ahead the fire that would not die continued to burn. The crawler rolled over endless dunes where the sky kissed the earth in silence, and the sand shifted like waves under moonlight. Raylan kept his eyes on the horizon, while Saria sat quiet, her fingers tracing invisible symbols on the metal seat, and Kale watched Vera drive with one hand steady and one hand near her blade, because trust was a rare thing in the wastelands, and she was not ready to give it away. They moved for hours through the dead wind where no machine could follow, and no drone could survive the heat. Vera said they were close to the place she never spoke of by name, a hidden refuge whispered about in old rebel songs, where the banished tribes lived without rule or law, beyond the reach of the Council and its watching sky. Saria asked if the tribe would help them, and Vera gave no answer, just a glance that said nothing was ever free, not even hope. When the sun began to rise like fire breaking through ash, the crawler stopped at the edge of a great canyon where the earth had cracked long ago and fallen in a shadow. Below, giant stones stood like sentinels carved by time and wind, and in the silence between them came a sound not made by nature a song, without words carried by air that moved like breath. Vera stepped down, first her blade still sheathed, and her head bowed. She told them to follow, and say nothing until spoken to. Raylan helped Saria down, while Kale scanned the area, nervously gripping a small tool like a talisman. They walked into the canyon where shadows danced along the rock walls, and the ground felt alive under their feet. From the darkness came figures wrapped in cloth and dust, their faces hidden by bone masks and painted eyes. They said nothing, only watched with stillness that made Kale's skin crawl and Saria's heart beat like a drum. At the center of the canyon stood a great circle of stones around a fire that burned without fuel, flames blue and gold and green, like memories set free. An old woman rose from beside the fire, her mask cracked with age and her eyes brighter than the stars. She called herself Errand Keeper of Breath and Flame, and said she had seen them in her dreams long before they came. She looked at Saria first and called her the child of stolen water, whose tears would shape mountains. Then at Raylan, whom she called the walker of broken skies, and finally at Kale the spark waiting to become storm. Aaron said they had come to ask for help, but the tribe did not give help. They gave choices, and each choice came with a cost. She told them the council was preparing to erase all records of rebellion, to silence not just people, but memory itself through a pulse weapon buried in the capital, a machine of light and shadow that would erase the minds of thousands, turning the world into a blank page once again. Raylan stood and spoke with no fear. He said the world had been silent too long, and if the tribe stood aside again, there would be nothing left to remember, not even names or faces or the fire they carried in their hearts. The tribe listened without moving, and then Erin raised her hand, and the fire rose higher, swallowing the colors of the dawn. She said they would help, but only if the three passed the trial of stone and win a test that would prove they could carry not just weapons but the weight of hope. Vera said she would wait at the edge for one day, and no longer, because even hope had a price and hers was running out. The trial began at night under a sky filled with falling stars. The first test was silence. They were led into a chamber of echoes where they had to find each other without voice or sound, guided only by the beating of hearts and the breath of the earth. Raylan moved slow, listening to the whispers in the stone until he found Kale by touch, and then Saria, who had waited in stillness like the wind before a storm. The second test was truth. They were taken to a place of mirrors, each one showing not faces, but moments of failure. Raylan saw himself leaving behind friends to save a mission. Kale saw his brother taken by enforcers, while he hid. Saria saw her mother crying alone as the water was stolen again. And again, they had to speak the truth, allowed to move forward, and each word felt like fire on the tongue, but they spoke them still. The final test was trust. They were taken to a cliff where the wind screamed and the night seemed endless. They were told to jump without knowing what waited below, not knowing if the tribe would catch them or let them fall. Raylan took Saria's hand, and Kale followed, and together they stepped into the dark. They fell not into death, but into a soft net of vines and cloth held by hands strong and silent. The tribe waited below, smiling not with lips, but with eyes, and Aaron stood once more, saying they had passed where they had walked through fear and spoken truth and trusted the unknown. That night the tribe gave them fire that burned cold and clear, a gift of old power and memory, something only shared once in a generation, and with it came warriors masked and silent, ready to follow the fire back into the cities, ready to make the council remember what it had tried to forget. Raylan looked at Saria and saw in her the strength of oceans and storms, and in Kale the spark now burning bright, and knew the war was not yet won, but the fire had grown too strong to die. The city of glass and steel stood under the red sky like a wound open and wide where silence crawled and the machines breathed no more. Raylan led the charge through shadows, and broken code his mind, clear his steps, sure every corner watched by old eyes, and whispering circuits. The council's tower rose in the center like a sword stabbing the sky, and its lights blinked with warnings no one could hear. Behind him came Saria, her hands glowing with light, not fire, not magic, but something older her breath, calm her heart steady. Every step she took was followed by a pulse in the ground, and the air moved around her like it remembered who she was. Kale followed, close, clutching the case that held the virus they had built in secret, a weapon of memory and rebellion crafted from dust, tears, and the stories of the dead. Around them marched the tribe, warriors of wind and stone, who had never bowed, who had never forgotten the names of their fallen masked and silent. They moved like ghosts with fire in their blood and vengeance in their eyes. Vera walked at their side, her sword drawn, her face unmasked, her rage quiet and burning sharp as glass. She had once guarded the tower. Now she would break it from within. The streets of the capital were empty, not because the people had fled, but because the council had locked them inside their homes, fed them illusions through glowing screens, told them lies about safety, about protection, about peace, while beneath the tower a machine hummed, waiting to erase it all. One final pulse meant to turn minds in a static, in a silence, into obedience without question. Raylan knew the path, the council's layout etched in his memory from stolen data and blood maps. They entered through an old vent buried behind a wall of forgotten code, bypassed the main gates, where drones hovered like silent birds. Each level they climbed brought new defenses, lasers, sensors, machines that once were tools now turned into weapons of fear. But Kale danced through them, with fingers quick and eyes sharp, disabling each one with a grin that never reached his eyes. Surya touched the walls as they passed, leaving behind marks that pulsed like veins of light, whispering to the systems to wake up, to remember what they were before the council turned them dark. At one checkpoint, a machine blinked and spoke her name, not in threat, but in welcome, and the path opened without a sound. The building remembered her mother, her voice, her song, and for a moment the air felt like a cradle, not a cage. When they reached the core chamber, the room pulsed with blue light, and the machine stood in silence, tall and wide like a sleeping god, its cables spread across the floor like roots feeding on memory, feeding on pain. Above it hovered the council heads wrapped in wires, their faces smooth and smiling, their eyes empty and glowing. They did not move, they only watched. Raylan stepped forward, spoke, not to beg, not to plead, but to declare that this was the end, that their silence had broken, that memory could not be erased, not by force, not by fear. The council responded with calm, their voices one and cold, saying the world had grown tired of pain, that forgetting was mercy, that peace required obedience. Surya raised her hands, and the walls began to shake. Light poured from her fingers into the ground, into the cables, into the machine. She did not fight it, she embraced it. She reminded the machine of songs of childhood, of oceans of laughter of the day. Her mother gave her the stone of light and said, never forget who you are. Kale opened the case and released the virus, not a sickness, but a memory, a wave of truth coded in love and sacrifice, in names of rebels carved into stone. The virus flowed through the system like wind through fire, catching every wire, every screen, every hidden I'd showed the people would have been stolen. It gave them back their memories, their pain, their stories. The council screamed without sound, their bodies cracking, their wires snapping, their lights dimming one by one. They fell not with violence, but with truth. The machine at the center shuddered and groaned, its lights flickering, its core pulsing slower and slower until it stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of breath, of tears, of names spoken aloud across the city. People emerged from their locked homes, eyes wide, voices hoarse, calling to each other, calling to themselves. For the first time in years, they remembered not just fear but hope. Vera dropped her sword at the base of the tower, walked out into the street, and looked up at the sky. For the first time in a long time, she smiled, not for victory, but for freedom. Raylan stood beside her and closed his eyes, feeling the weight lift, not all at once, but piece by piece. Surya wept quietly, not from sorrow, but from the flood of feeling that poured through her chest and into the air around her. Kale laughed, finally laughed like a boy who had carried too much for too long and now could breathe. The city began to sing, not in melody, not in harmony, but in voices raw and real, one by one, lighting fires not to destroy, but to guide the lost home. The tribe returned to the wind, to the stones, to the silence they knew so well, leaving behind warriors born of fire and story, ready to build again, not a kingdom, but a chorus of memory that would never fade again.